Okay, so as we said at the end of the last lecture, Socrates once again refutes Thrasymachus, shows that his attempts to sort of come up or to defend his definition of justice as the advantage of the stronger, the attempts are not that successful. Socrates, is able to refute them, is able to show that he really can't maintain them with any kind of consistency. And the way Socrates tells it, it's not even very difficult. So Thrasymachus, once again, has been kind of refuted, shown that a ruler in the precise sense will only be focused on perfecting his art, and the art of ruling looks to the advantage of the ruled, not to the advantage of the ruler. And Thrasymachus gets angry and he asks Socrates if he has a wet nurse, in other words, a nurse who nurses a baby for a mother. In the old days, wealthy people would hire them rather than the mother nursing the baby herself. In other words, he says, Socrates, you're like an infant. He's obviously an insult. He says he has a sniveling nose and so on. So he's clearly insulting Socrates, saying, you don't, again, trying to say, look, you're like an infant. You're so naive. It's like you're, like you're a baby. I mean, you have no idea what's actually going on out there. And he uses this example of shepherds and sheep. And he says, look, you're talking about the rule, about rulers as if they're shepherds, as if they're out there watching over the sheep. But let's be realistic. Sure, a shepherd, when he's watching the sheep, the art of shepherding is concerned with the good of the sheep. He doesn't want the sheep to get carried off by wolves or to fall off a cliff or anything like that. But it's not because he cares about the sheep or he wants them to be happy or he wants them to flourish or something like that. It's because he wants some lamb chops and a nice warm coat. Temporarily, in the short term, sure, the shepherd has to watch out for the sheep, has to make sure that the sheep are safe and that they're relatively well taken care of, but that's only so that he can benefit from them. So Thrasymachus says, it's naive to think, sure, again, Saddam Hussein, Hitler, people who just destroy their country, yeah, they're not very good rulers. But the people who are good rulers and are not destroying their countries or their cities in the ancient Greek context, they're not doing it because they care about their city or they care about their fellow citizens or because they care about anybody other than themselves. They just do it because you can't really exploit a city that's a disaster area. You need a relatively healthy and successful city in order to benefit as a ruler. So sure, they may look somewhat to the good of the citizens, somewhat to the good of their city, just like a shepherd, again, doesn't want all of his sheep to get eaten by wolves, but it's not because he cares about them, it's because he wants to benefit from them. And Thrasymachus says, it's the same way with rulers. And of course, this is powerful because in much of ancient Greek poetry and so on, just as in the Bible and in Christian literature, shepherd and sheep was already used often as a metaphor for ruling, but of course in a much more kind of in the opposite sense that Thrasymachus gives it here, and the idea that a good ruler is like a shepherd taking care of his sheep, making sure that they're safe and so on. And Thrasymachus says, yeah, up until the day when he eats them. And he says, again, that's what ruling is like. And he goes even further and says, Socrates, you have to consider everywhere the unjust man is better off than the just man. And again, there's an almost kind of comic obsession that he has here with material gain, with how the unjust man gets the better. He doesn't pay his taxes, and he gets the better in contracts. And when there's anything involving money, the unjust man always comes out ahead of the just man. And again, it's sort of Thrasymachus so concerned with money. Here, maybe Plato kind of playing it up almost in a kind of comical way, again, to indicate that Thrasymachus is somewhat more conventional than he might seem. And he makes this argument, and he basically says, look, if you really want to know what I'm talking about, I'm not even talking about somebody, a pickpocket or a cut purse, as he puts it, someone who goes and steals a little bit of money from somebody. Let's look at injustice, perfect injustice, as he calls it. Injustice at the highest level, which is tyranny, which is when someone takes over a city and, as he puts it, enslaves all of the citizens. He says then when people do it on a small level, when they steal from a person, when they steal from a temple, then they get called names, then they get attacked, accused, abused in different ways. When they take over an entire city and when they enslave the people and really rule in a way that clearly is only for their own good, then he says they get called happy, then they get admired. Not only by the people of their own city who have to say that because now they're the tyrant, but anybody who hears about it is filled with, he doesn't really say this, but it's like they're filled with envy. He says, anybody who hears about this blesses them and says, well, they must be happy. A tyrant is happy. And as he puts it, he says, it's not because people fear doing injustice, but because they fear suffering injustice that they praise justice. And Glaucon will really pick this up and develop it. A lot of Thrasymachus' arguments here about how tyranny is better than better than anything else, Glaucon is really the one who picks these up and really kind of develops them and sticks with them. Thrasymachus makes this big speech, but then kind of backs away from certain parts of it. So this speech that he makes here is very important and is an important part of what happens here between Thrasymachus and Socrates. So again, he says, it's because they're afraid of suffering injustice that they blame them. He doesn't really develop this as much. He basically just says the unjust man is happier, is better, and then he tries to go away, but Socrates says, no, you can't leave, and no one else wants him to leave. And he says, Thrasymachus, what we're talking about here is what we should really base our lives on. Should we try to be just or unjust? What's going on? And Thrasymachus says, I know, I agree, and I'm telling you, and now I just want to leave because I don't want to have to deal with these questions again, Socrates. But they all persuade. Socrates says, look, there are all these people. It wouldn't be a bad investment. Hint, hint. You might pick up some students. You like that. You like money. People may end up becoming your students, and so on. It would be good for you to stay and do a service. In other words, kind of appealing to him to be just, but of course for self-interested reasons. And so basically he says, you should stay. And Socrates basically goes back to this idea and says, well, once again though, the ruler, anyone who's really practicing an art, is not looking to their own good. He says they may benefit from it, but that's because they practice what he calls the wage-earning art in addition to whatever their other art is. So he says, remember, every art is very precise. So the art of piloting looks to piloting a ship. The art of medicine looks to physical health. And he says they're not, in addition to that, looking to earn wages. He says that's a separate art that every artist practices in addition to his own distinctive art. In order to make a living, in order to actually make it possible for him to practice his art. So Socrates says, just like if you're sailing, you're out on the ocean, lots of fresh air, exercise, sunlight, you're going to be healthy. Sailing will make you healthy, but he says that doesn't make it the art of medicine. In the same way, if you're a doctor, you might make money, but that doesn't make it the wage-earning art. You practice the wage-earning art in addition to the art of medicine. So again, he comes back to this idea and he says, look, the person who's really devoted to an art, the person who's really practicing an art, doesn't benefit from that. Therefore, the ruler doesn't benefit from ruling. That's why we have to pay rulers. I mean, if when somebody took over as governing a city or whatever, and when they started, they looked like Wallace Shawn, and a couple of years later they looked like George Clooney. Well, we wouldn't have to pay people. We certainly wouldn't have to build statues to them and do all these things to honor them. He says, it would be obvious how you benefit, but as it is, he says, we have to give people money, we have to give them honors, we have to, maybe they suffer the penalty. This interest Glaucon, this idea that one reason somebody might rule is not to suffer the penalty of being ruled by somebody worse. But Socrates says, if ruling were so obviously advantageous for somebody, then everybody would just want to rule, and we wouldn't have to compensate them in some ways if they're somehow giving something up and not benefiting in some way. So he comes back to this idea again that the ruler is concerned with the ruled, and the ruler, as practicing the art of ruling, doesn't benefit. But then he says, they come back, and Thrasymachus says, look, again, justice, he says. Socrates says, well, let's think about it. Are you saying that injustice is good or profitable but shameful? So, if you steal money, obviously it's profitable, you have money, but it's shameful. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't admit to other people that that's where you got the money and so on. And Thrasymachus says, no, I'm saying injustice is good. And therefore, he basically says that it's very close to virtue itself. And Socrates says, well, now that's really something. A lot of people would say, well, injustice is profitable. You steal, you benefit in some way, but it's shameful. You shouldn't admit to it. You shouldn't say that it's happening. Thrasymachus, he says, you're going further and actually saying injustice is good, that it's not shameful, it's actually choice-worthy, that's what you should do is be unjust. And Thrasymachus says that's right. It's good counsel. It's something like virtue. It's fair and mighty. It's more powerful. It's better, and so on. He says justice actually is shameful because you're kind of being a rube or a fool. You're being taken advantage of, and you should be ashamed of that. You shouldn't be proud of being a simpleton who everybody else is taking advantage of. It's actually kind of embarrassing. And so he says, so he really makes this claim that injustice is better than justice, really kind of claiming here that injustice is really virtue, and justice is not quite vice, but is just sort of simple-mindedness, naivete, something that you certainly shouldn't be proud of, and if anything, you should be somewhat embarrassed by. And so we can deal with Socrates' refutations here fairly briefly, fairly quickly. None of them are super convincing, and Thrasymachus himself eventually kind of gives up and indicates, all right, look, I could respond, but I don't, I know that you'd say that I'm talking for too long, so I'm just going to agree. We'll get to that in a second. But Socrates begins, and so he starts to respond by saying, basically, his argument is something like this. Again, we'll sort of simplify, different steps, but just to kind of simplify. He says, the just person tries to get the better of the unjust person, but not of the just person. So in other words, the just people cooperate with each other, but they try to get the better of the unjust. If there's a competition, they think they should win. Thrasymachus says, of course they think that. They wouldn't be able to. Socrates says, that's not what I'm asking. The just people try to get the better of the unjust, but not of other just people. So they try to get the better of people who are unlike them, but not of people who are like them. And Thrasymachus agrees, and they also agree that the unjust person, by contrast, tries to get the better of everybody. Tries to get the better of just people, tries to get the better of unjust people, tries to do better than everybody, tries to get more than them, tries to take from them, whatever exactly is meant by get the better of. And then Socrates says, now, what about the person who actually knows? Is the person who knows trying to get the better of those unlike him, as well as those like him, or just those, or is the person who knows trying to get the better of everybody, or just of those who are unlike them? Now, so in other words, someone who knows mathematics will argue and say that he knows better than someone who doesn't know, but someone who knows mathematics isn't going to look over at someone else who knows mathematics and say, oh, you got 8, you got 8, well I got 9, and so on and so forth. They're not going to try to get higher answers. He used the example of tuning an instrument. Two musical people are going to try to tune the instrument the same way, namely correctly. They're not going to try to tune it higher than each other. Whereas Socrates says someone who's ignorant, who doesn't know, will again, get the better of is an odd way of putting it here, but will disagree with everybody. Now, of course, you would have to be something besides just ignorant. You may know that you don't know how to tune an instrument and therefore not even try. But he says, someone who doesn't know tries to get the better of everybody. Will, in other words, disagree with everybody. Someone who doesn't know mathematics will disagree with both people who do know and people who don't. They'll tune an instrument differently from people who do know and other people who don't know. So Socrates says, so if those who know only try to get the better of those who are unlike them, namely the ignorant, but not of those who are like them, they actually try to do the same or come to the same conclusions or practice their art in the same way as those who are like them, those who know, and the just are the same way. They try to get the better of those who are unlike them, but not those who are like them. And Socrates says, and the ignorant try to get the better of everybody, just like the unjust try to get the better of everyone. Then he says, then the just are like the knowledgeable, and the unjust are like the ignorant. And this kind of goes against part of what Thrasymachus said, that it's the unjust who really know and are really knowledgeable, and the unjust and the just are naive and confused and don't know what they're doing. So is this a very convincing argument? I mean, not really. I mean, it's I have to confess to some failings as a naturalist here. I don't know exactly which kind of animals eat each other and which don't, but let's say that bears eat their young sometimes. So bears eat other bears as well as those who are unlike them. So they eat those who are like them, other bears. They also eat those who are unlike them, salmon and so on. And let's say that eagles never eat other eagles. Again, I don't know if this is true or not, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it is. Therefore, eagles try to get the better of those who are unlike them. They eat the salmon and so on, but not of those who are like them. They don't eat other eagles. So by this same logic, since the eagles are trying to get the better of those who are unlike them, but not those who are like them, the eagles are just and knowledgeable. And since the bears are eating everybody, other bears, trout, people, whatever, then the bears are unjust because they're trying to get the better of everybody. Of course, and therefore they're also ignorant. They're like the ignorant, they're also like the unjust, and therefore they're also part of the same package. Of course, this isn't really true. I mean, the eagles are operating on instinct, just like the bears. It's not that one of them is using knowledge and one of them isn't. It's kind of hard to see how, certainly from the point of view of the salmon, the eagle is no more just than the bear. It's kind of strange that you would say, well, therefore eagles are just and bears are unjust. It doesn't really work in that way, but that's basically what Socrates is saying, because there's this one similarity that they try to get the better of those who are like them, as well as those who are unlike them. The unjust and the ignorant are the same, and because the just try to get the better only of those who are unlike them and not those who are like them, they're like the knowledgeable. So these two groups belong together on each side, just and knowledgeable, unjust and ignorant. And again, it's not very convincing. It doesn't really work. There are plenty of other groupings, plenty of other things like bears and eagles that you could also fit into these that have these same similarities. And then, of course, there's just the common sense rejoinder that you could say, well, look, I mean, there are plenty of knowledgeable people who are unjust. Simply being knowledgeable doesn't make you just, and there are plenty of, now, again, this goes back to some of the argument with some of the discussion between Socrates and Polemarchus. Maybe there's a limit to how ignorant you can be and actually be just. According to Socrates, according to Polemarchus, you need some knowledge of how to actually do good. But in any case, certainly you can be fairly knowledgeable and still choose to be unjust. It doesn't necessarily carry through the way that they try to argue here. So there's that argument, and that sort of refutes him. And in the middle of it, something odd happens. At 350d, Socrates says Thrasymachus was actually blushing, and he was sort of surprised by this, and no one's really sure what to make of this. Why does Thrasymachus blush? What does it mean? But in any case, he does blush. He seems to be embarrassed by something. And then he basically says, okay, Socrates, I see what you're doing here, and I really don't agree with it. I'm really not convinced by what you're saying. And he says, but I know if I were to try to reply, you'd say I was making a public harangue, I was making a big, long speech, and you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't accept it. You would argue and say that we have to do this question and answer. So he says, either let me reply in the way that I want, at the length that I want, or else, he says, I'm just going to nod my head and agree like I'm talking to an old woman and say, oh, yes, I know, that is bad luck, and so on. But I'm just going to go along with you just for the sake of making this easy. I'm just going to stop worrying about what you say. I'm not going to worry about whether or not I agree. I'm just going to agree with you. Whether or not I really agree, I'm just going to agree with you to make things easy. Socrates says, oh, not against what you really think. And Thrasymachus says, yes, I don't care. So Socrates says, okay, so then, let's go on. And he basically goes on, and he makes sort of, the next thing he says, a city that's trying to enslave other cities, that would be an unjust city, right? And Thrasymachus says, yes. And Socrates says, but if this unjust city, which is trying to take over other cities and be unjust, if it's so unjust that internally it can't hold itself together, if the citizens are so unjust that they're attacking each other, then it can't even be a very good unjust city. It can't be a good imperial city. It won't be able to take over anybody else if it collapses into civil war itself. He says the same thing, a group of thieves, a group of pirates. I mean, if they're fighting among themselves, if a group of bank robbers go into a bank and they're trying to rob it, and before they even get out of the bank, they start shooting each other because they're fighting over the money, because they're so unjust, they can't even cooperate to carry out the robbery, well then they're not a very successful gang of bank robbers. So Socrates says, so surely some amount of justice is needed just to carry out these acts. Someone who's really, truly, purely unjust, or a city, a group that is so unjust that they can't cooperate, they won't even be able to perform injustice successfully. And Thrasymachus says, yeah, sure. And then Socrates says, and the same is true of an individual. If we understand by injustice simply gratifying whatever desire you have, simply doing whatever you want, even if it's bad, even if it's unjust in some way, he says, an individual who doesn't have any self-control will also not be able to be successfully unjust. If you're a cat burglar, but you just give in to whatever desire you have and you just eat whatever you want, and then you weigh 400 pounds, you probably won't be a very successful cat burglar. So even just to commit injustice, you need a certain amount of what Socrates here calls justice, but what he seems to just kind of identify as discipline or organization, or again, in a group, cooperation. So now here we kind of go back to that joking thing that he had suggested at first. Justice is justice as the advantage of the stronger. Does that mean simply justice is whatever makes you strong? That justice is just the cooperation, the discipline, whatever it is that is required to actually become strong, like beef is required to become physically strong, is justice simply whatever is required to become strong? That's kind of what he's saying here, that you need some measure of justice in the sense of cooperation in a group, whether it's a city or a group of criminals, and some kind of organization or discipline in that city, in that group, and also some kind of organization or discipline in the individual, because again, if the individual is so unjust that they're just doing whatever they want, then they won't actually be able to be very successfully unjust in any kind of significant or long-term way. Okay? And then finally he goes on and he says, look, does everything have a special virtue and a special sort of work that it does? And he says, ruling as well as living is the work of the soul, and justice is the virtue of the soul. Therefore, the soul can't do its distinctive work, ruling, deliberating, living especially, without justice. You can't live well without justice. Living is the particular action of the soul, and the soul needs its virtue to be able to do that well. So in order to live well, you have to be just. And Thrasymachus here is just kind of openly saying, yeah, sure, Socrates, whatever you want. He even says at the end, let that be your fill here on the feast of Bendis, and I'm laying it out for you, and I'm just going to agree. He makes it fairly clear that he doesn't actually accept any of this, and then Socrates himself at the end says that he doesn't believe it either, because as Socrates says when Thrasymachus uses this metaphor, this image of him agreeing as if he's laying out a feast for Socrates, Socrates says, but it hasn't been a good feast, but he says, it's my fault, I'm like a glutton who just eats whatever is put in front of him. And he says, the thing is, we started arguing about which was better, trying to figure out which one was better, justice or injustice, when we hadn't even defined justice. We didn't even know what justice was. So of course you can't tell whether it's good or bad when you don't even know what it is. So he says, but that's my fault, because we were trying to discover what justice is, and then we got sidetracked into this, or sort of somebody brought up and said that Thrasymachus said that injustice was better than justice. And Socrates says, I just started to gobble that up and started to say, well, which one is better, justice or injustice? And we got into all of these arguments and discussions and so on. But Socrates says, it doesn't make any sense because we didn't even know what justice was. So surely we can't say whether it's good or bad and whether it's better or worse than injustice. So he ends by basically sort of saying himself that all of these arguments that he's just made, claiming that justice is better than injustice, are themselves basically maybe not worthless, but not fully valid either, because again, they haven't even defined justice or injustice, so they can't really determine which is better, which is worse. And so book one ends that way. Thrasymachus' initial definition of justice as the advantage of the stronger is kind of refuted in somewhat technical senses, but again, Socrates never comes back and sort of establishes that in terms of actual politics that justice is something more than that. He never kind of shows or really tries to show that he does sort of indicate in some ways that ruling is obviously not simply beneficial for the rulers, but he never kind of dismisses or reacts to or never fully vanquishes Thrasymachus' larger point that the sort of cynical point that justice is just the advantage of the stronger. He trips him up in many ways, but never completely refutes it. And therefore, at the beginning of book two, Glaucon kind of again picks up some of what Thrasymachus is saying, and in many ways argues it in a way that's much more compelling and much more interesting. But book one ends with Socrates saying, well, we didn't even establish what justice is, so it ends with a kind of classic, again, Socrates saying, I know that I know nothing. I don't know what justice is, but at least I know that, and everyone else in the book has sort of come in kind of cocksure and thought that they knew what justice was, but, and I don't know, but at least I've shown that other people don't know, and again, at least I know that I don't know, so it kind of ends on that note.